Hello everyone, and welcome to the inaugural episode of Art Hystoria, an art history YouTube podcast that aims to go deep into showcasing the awesome women and minorities of art history that often get overlooked. In this episode, we are headed to Paris, France, to explore one of my favorite artists who lived during the French Revolution, Elisabeth Vigee Lebrun. Elisabeth was born on April 16, 1755, to Jean and Louis Vigee. Her mother worked as a hairdresser, and her father Louis was a portrait artist whose main medium was pastels. The family, by all accounts, lived a fairly middle-class sort of existence, thanks to the jobs of the two parents, and 3 years after Elisabeth was born, her younger brother, Etienne, was born. By all accounts, she was very attached to her family, and she did not enjoy being sent away to boarding school. She was very often sent home, however, from this boarding school due to various illnesses, and eventually they just let her stay home entirely, and in her own words, she was overjoyed at having to not leave home again. It was presumably during this time that she learned how to draw and paint from her father. He was thrilled by his daughter's skills and declared in a quote from her memoir, "You will be a painter, child, if there ever was one." Honestly, her home life sounded downright idyllic at this time. Her father helped her nurture her creativity, and he exposed both of his children to numerous great thinkers and artists, as well as plays and so on. Her brother, Etienne, was also a creative and went on to become a playwright. However, this happy family life was not meant to last, for her father Louis became seriously ill, and after 2 months of suffering, he finally passed away on May 9th, 1767. I find that his final words to his children were really sweet. He just told them, "Be happy, my children." Elisabeth, of course, was devastated by this loss, and she found that for quite some time she was unable to paint. One of the bright spots in the family's period of mourning was that her father's best friend, Gabriel Francois Doyen, still visited them. He, along with her mother, encouraged Elisabeth to continue her painting. Elisabeth did, of course, continue painting, and she joined her best friend, Rosalie Bouquet-Filleul, in impromptu lessons with the painter Gabriel Briard. She largely spent her teen years studying and creating pastel portraiture for money. Her income kept the family afloat financially for the most part until she needed to start paying for her brother's schooling. Because of this, her mother decided that she would need to remarry, and she ended up wedding a jeweler named Jacques-François Lesèvre. It is common knowledge from her memoir that she detested this man. He turned out to be a stingy skinflint of a man who appropriated all of her earnings for himself. She left us a spicy little quote in her memoir. It goes like this: "I detested the man, the more as he had appropriated my father's wardrobe, and wore all the clothes just as they were without having them altered to fit him." Nevertheless, she put up with this behavior for the sake of her mother, and the family moved to his Rue Saint-Honoré residence, which happened to overlook the terrace of the Palais Royal. It was here that her fame really began to take off, as she was in such close proximity to the nobility. She painted many notable figures during this time, including Louis-Marie Adelaide de Bourbon, who in turn recommended Elisabeth to all of her friends, and thus Elisabeth's fame really began to snowball. Her stepfather, however, became displeased with all of the attentions that Elisabeth and her mother received in Paris, so he made them spend the weekends with him in a cottage at the edge of Paris in the countryside. Elisabeth hated the cottage in Chaillot, where there was little amusement save for an ill-situated, anemic garden. These forays to the countryside, however, did lead her to her very first meeting with Queen Marie Antoinette at the gardens at Marly-le-Roi. Little did she realize she would eventually become the Queen's favored portrait painter before long. Around the time that she was 20, Elisabeth's stepfather retired and they moved to the Rue de Cléry, where she ended up meeting Monsieur Lebrun. Jean-Baptiste Pierre Lebrun was an art dealer, and he would lend Elisabeth works of the great masters to copy. Eventually, he would also become her agent and propose marriage to her. Though her mother encouraged the match, many of her friends and patrons advised her against the match. Aubert, the crown jeweler, even went so far as to tell her, "It would be better for you to tie a stone around your neck and jump into the river than marry Mr. Lebrun." Though Elisabeth did not feel terribly inclined to marry, she ultimately accepted his proposal, at least in part by her desire to escape her stepfather, whose bad temper had only increased since his retirement. She would admit, however, that she exchanged one trouble for another. Whereas Lebrun was gentle and obliging, he came with a terrible gambling problem. He would also take her earnings as well to feed his addiction. In 1779, Elisabeth painted Queen Marie Antoinette for the first time. This would be the Marie Antoinette with the rose painting that still resides at the Palace of Versailles. This is probably one of her most famous and recognized works. Indeed, it winds up on various souvenirs and merchandise to this day. I would also like to make note that this piece is more in the Rococo style, and at this time Elisabeth had actually begun experimenting more with a neoclassical style. Her portrait of the Duchess de Gramont, done no more than a year later, exhibits more of this neoclassical style. Her sitter even allowed her to style her with draped fabric and unpowdered hair. On February 12, 1780, Elisabeth gave birth to her first and only child, Jeanne-Lucie Louise, whom she affectionately called Julie. Though she adored her daughter, she didn't let motherhood slow down her career, and before long, she became the official portrait artist for the Queen. She created a number of paintings for the Queen, some of which are her most famous today. One of note was Marie Antoinette in a chemise dress. This painting in particular caused a lot of controversy. Though many liked the relaxed and personable representation of the Queen, still many others found her attire wholly inappropriate, as the comfortable chemise was, oh my gosh, an easily accessible garment for all the classes. Ironically, despite all the shade being cast, many women immediately began copying the style of dress, which came to be known as the chemise à la reine. On May 31st, 1783, Elisabeth was finally accepted as a member of the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture. She had previously been denied because her husband was an art dealer. This seems like a fairly bogus reason to me, but who am I? Thankfully, however, the Academy caved to pressure from the King and Queen, and Elisabeth, as well as her colleague Adelaide Labille Guiard, were both inducted on the same day. They were only two of a total of 15 women who had been granted membership between the dates of 1648 and 1793. As her reception piece, Elisabeth submitted an allegorical painting called Peace Bringing Back Abundance. This was instead of her usual portraiture. Because of this, the Academy did not place her work within the two standard categories of painting of either history or portraiture. This seems to me like it's maybe some shade, but I could be wrong, but it definitely feels shady. At this point, Elisabeth was clearly at the high point of her career. She was a royal portrait artist, she befriended a queen, and even danced at the balls of Versailles. But alas, this would all come crashing down with the Revolution. With the storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789, the French Revolution began in earnest. As the year of 1789 progressed, more and more terror began to seize the community. Elisabeth's home had been vandalized, and criminals threw sulfur into her cellars. Not to mention, there were vulgar rumors being spread about her, and she couldn't even look out her own window without having insults hurled at her. She now lived in a continual state of anxiety and sadness, and her physical health too was beginning to suffer, with each day bringing news of more atrocities and learning of more of her friends being murdered. Elisabeth prepared to flee with her daughter. Just as her carriage was packed and ready to go, a crowd of National Guardsmen burst into her home with muskets. They made threats and they harassed her, insisting that she must stay in France. Thankfully, they ended up leaving, but shortly afterwards 2 of them returned and urged her to leave as soon as possible. They also advised her that she should take a stagecoach, as it would be much safer than her own personal carriage. She found herself incredibly grateful for their advice, because it very likely saved her life. On October 5th, as part of the Women's March on Versailles, the King and Queen were conducted back to Paris, surrounded by pikes. Though Elisabeth feared for her friends, she boarded a stagecoach around midnight on that day, and after being seen off by her brother and her husband, she would leave France for nearly 12 years. Her first stop during her exile was Rome, and she immediately set about painting a self-portrait for the Florence Gallery. Thankfully, due to her fame and connections, she had no shortage of portrait work. Her works during this time shifted solidly into the neoclassical style, and she continued her allegorical paintings, turning her sitters into Greek goddesses or plucky heroines. She was also rather swiftly accepted into the Accademia of Parma, as well as the Accademia di San Luca, which is in sharp contrast to the many years and persuasion it took for her to be accepted into the French Academy of Painting and Sculpture. She was also able to find much solace in Rome after having to flee her homeland. In fact, she painted her favorite work there, which is the Emma Hamilton as the Persian Sibyl. She would go on to display it at various salons during her exile as she traveled across Europe. This painting now has its home at the Met in New York, so if you live in the US, you could travel to go see it. I might actually want to. After spending a few years touring Italy, she began longing for her homeland again, and she headed to Turin with the original intention of returning to France from there. However, upon her arrival, she was shocked to find the town absolutely flooded with French refugees, all of them bearing terrible tales of woe. She helped those refugees as much as she could, and decided that instead of France, she would head to Vienna. In Vienna, she met with many notables and painted a number of beautiful portraits and allegorical works. She was also invited to a number of fêtes and balls, and enjoyed the city and its parks, which she found to be quite picturesque. However, not everything was joyous in Vienna, and before long she began hearing news of many of her friends back in Paris being guillotined. Her best friend, Rosalie Filleul, was one of the unfortunates. Elisabeth wrote of it in her memoir. Alas, how well I remember Madame Filleul saying to me on the eve of my departure from France, when I was to escape the horrors I foresaw, "You are wrong to go. I intend to stay, because I believe in the happiness the revolution will bring us." And that revolution took her to the scaffold. It was also here in Vienna that she learned of the executions of both the king and the queen. She was so greatly affected by all of this that she stopped reading the newspapers and avoided discussing anything regarding the deaths of her friends. Elisabeth stayed in Vienna for almost 3 years before she headed to St. Petersburg after receiving numerous invitations to visit. Her original plan was to stay in Vienna until it was safe for her to return to France, but as that was still not an option, and she was quite curious about Catherine the Great, she decided to go. As she traveled to St. Petersburg, she made a stop in Dresden and visited the famous Dresden Gallery. There she viewed the Sistine Madonna by Raphael and was very taken by it. She considered Raphael to be one of the greatest painters of all time. She arrived in St. Petersburg on July 25, 1795. Arriving at the height of summer allowed her to experience her first polar summer, or midnight sun, where the sun never actually completely sets and there is no night. No sooner had she arrived in town when the visits began. She was to be presented to Catherine the Great without having a chance to have a suitable gown made for such an event. She went into the meeting a tizzy of nerves and fell into a bit of fangirling, as we would call it today, and she found Catherine the Great to be altogether so lovely that her shyness finally left her. Catherine the Great actually wished for Elisabeth to stay in the palace with her so she could watch her paint, but court intrigues prevented that from happening. However, Elisabeth was glad for it, as she greatly enjoyed her freedom to roam about. Her time in St. Petersburg was a whirlwind of activity. She was invited to many dinners, parties, and various musical performances. She also painted a great deal of portraits as well. It was here that she painted her last known self-portrait, which she submitted to the St. Petersburg Academy of Arts. This painting is one of 2 which show her in the act of painting. She also painted Catherine the Great's granddaughters, Alexandra and Elena Pavlovna. They were originally dressed in Grecian tunics which exposed their arms. A bit of petty intrigue was started with this painting when the Empress's favorite Platon Zubov said Catherine the Great was scandalized by the bare skin, so Elisabeth painted sleeves over their bare arms. Only later did she find out this was not the case at all. Elisabeth was also prepared to paint a portrait of Catherine the Great herself, but alas, she passed away the day before Elisabeth was to paint her. Elisabeth was greatly saddened by her death, and colored by her time in revolutionary France. When she saw the crowds gathering in the palace square, she became worried there was to be a revolution in Russia as well. Thankfully, her fears were unfounded, as the crowds were all mourners, and even more mourners showed up in the days following for the lengthy funeral. I feel this incident just goes to show how greatly the trauma of the revolution affected her. Catherine the Great's funeral lasted about 6 weeks, where she was laid out in a cathedral for people to pay their respects. Catherine's son Paul ascended to the throne on December 12, 1796, and according to Elisabeth's memoirs, he was quick-tempered, easy to anger, and quickly fell into a tyrannical rule. Though she did not like the new emperor, she yet stayed in St. Petersburg and threw herself into her work. It was also here in St. Petersburg that her daughter Julie Lebrun came of age and was out in society. In the mornings while she painted, Elisabeth let Julie spend time with Countess Czernichev, and through her, Julie met and fell in love with a Mr. Negri. When Elisabeth discovered the schemes of the Countess to have Julie and Mr. Negri marry, she became quite upset. Elisabeth was opposed to the match, as she had hoped to see her daughter more comfortably situated with someone of greater status. She tried to persuade her daughter not to pursue this match, but Julie was unmoved. Elisabeth does not name names in her memoirs, but she says that many people began to spread rumors about her because she would not give in to everyone else's demands to see her daughter married to this man. Eventually, however, she did relent, and she wrote to Monsieur Lebrun for his permission, as it was still needed in that day and age. As the post was very slow in delivering letters, Julie began to accuse her mother of having not written a letter at all. Elisabeth even went so far as to let Julie read her subsequent letters and take them to the post herself. Still, Julie remained unconvinced and simply accused her mother of writing other letters behind her back. Needless to say, all of this caused a big rift between mother and daughter, and despite Monsieur Lebrun's eventual approval and the wedding finally taking place, no reconciliation was to be had between Elisabeth and her daughter Julie. While still feeling depressed over the falling out with her daughter, she also received the sad news that her mother had passed away. Hoping that a new change of scenery would lift her spirits, she thus headed to Moscow on October 15, 1800. In Moscow, her reception was very similar to that of St. Petersburg, and she painted many notable figures while she was there. However, she still longed for her homeland of France, so eventually she made one last visit with Julie in St. Petersburg, and then tried to head for home again. No sooner had she started her journey than she heard the news of the assassination of Emperor Paul, and following soon after, the coronation of Alexander I. She stopped in Berlin with the hopes of contacting the ambassador there, to be granted re-entry to France. While there, the Queen of Prussia invited her to Potsdam to paint her portrait. Elisabeth, of course, obliged, and quickly became friends with the Queen. She was even gifted an antique bracelet that became one of her most treasured gifts, and she wore it everywhere. Elisabeth eventually met with the ambassador and was pleased to find out that order and safety had been restored in France, and that her brother and husband had been successful in striking her name off the list of emigrants, and her French status had been restored. And with that good news, she made haste back to France. Upon her arrival back in France, she was tearfully met by her husband, brother, sister-in-law, and niece. She was overjoyed to finally be home again. Though her tearful reunions were not meant to last, though she loved being back home in France, the memories of the darker events of the Revolution still plagued her, and she found a need to get away. So she ended up leaving France on April 15, 1802, to go visit London. According to her memoirs, she did not seem to like London very much at all. She detested the cold weather and the dampness, and she wasn't very fond of their crowded balls, and she did not enjoy going to card parties either. Despite all this, she did manage to at least find it agreeable enough to spend 3 years there painting various people. Eventually, she did finally return back to France, where she was very happy to be reunited with and reconciled with her daughter, who had in fact left her husband. She was unable to convince her daughter to live with her again, but they were situated closely enough that Elisabeth was able to visit her daily. Tragedy would strike again, however, as Monsieur Lebrun would pass away, soon to be followed by the death of her daughter to illness on December 8, 1819. If that weren't devastating enough, she lost her brother in 1820. For the remainder of her life, she bought a home in Louveciennes and spent most of her time between there and Paris in the company of good friends. She eventually died in Paris on March 30th, 1842, at the age of 86. Well, I hope you enjoyed listening to my mini history on Elisabeth Vigee Lebrun. If you would like to learn even more details of her life, you can read her Memoirs of Madame Vigee Lebrun, which is available for free on Google Books. If you would, please let me know in the comments below if you would like to see this series continue. It was a lot of work to put together this first video, and if there's no interest, I would like to invest my time elsewhere. So yeah, just let me know if you like this, and I will continue. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.